hanging from a window of the Castle of Prague at 9 a.m. on Wednesday, the 23rd of May 1618, Wilhelm Slavata was rather frustrated by his situation. For him, as a highly esteemed representative of the Catholic House of Habsburg, this was all very unfamiliar. Just seconds earlier, he's been thrown out of the very same window by a group of Bohemian Protestants. Wilhelm Slavata was the second out of 3 men who were thrown out of that window that morning. Before him, his colleague Jaroslav Martinitz had left the castle in the same ignoble fashion. Now, Slavata felt the hilt of a sword hammering against his fingers, which made him lose his grip and fall into the 17-meter void below him. When he came to his senses, next to himself he found his secretary, Fabricius, who had been dispatched after him and, quite amazingly, had landed on his feet and was almost unharmed. Martinitz, his colleague, had landed a bit further away. While he was rushing down the ditch to help Slavata, he injured himself with his own saber. He too was hurt, but not badly. While shots were fired after them, the 3 Catholics escaped into the narrow alleyways of Prague. Slavata couldn't leave the city because his wounds prevented him from walking. Martinitz, however, set off to Bavaria, and Fabricius raced to Vienna to alert the emperor of what had just happened. Fabricius, formerly a mere secretary, would later be ennobled with the title von Hohenfall, which quite ironically translates to of high fall. It's somewhat surprising that all 3 defenestrated men survived their 17-meter fall. Protestants would later claim that they were only saved because they landed on a pile of dung, while Catholics thought that Mother Mary herself had softened their fall by unfurling her cloak underneath them. Because of this, Catholic battle cries in the 30 Years' War often refer to her. This event became known as the 1618 Defenestration of Prague. Given that there had been 2 similar cases in 1419 and 1483, defenestration can be regarded as a Bohemian tradition. In this video, we will look at the consequences of this event, which have entered history as the Bohemian Revolt. This is the commonly accepted start of the 30 Years' War, a war that claimed 8 million lives, devastated large stretches of Europe, especially Germany, and drastically transformed the political and religious map of Europe. This video is brought to you by Wondrium, a museum for your mind and a place for educational and entertaining video content brought to you by distinguished experts. For me, Wondrium is at its most interesting as a resource for discovering things I didn't know I needed to know about, which happened to me when I came across the course History's Great Military Blunders and the Lessons They Teach. For example, the episode about the Japanese Battle of Nagashino in 1575 thoroughly explores how rotating volley fire and palisades influenced the outcome of the battle. It's mind-blowing that the techniques of using gunpowder weapons evolved so similarly in the East and the West. As a military history content creator, it's amazing to be able to learn from such experts from the comfort of my home. But for me personally, it's more important to have variety than a single great course, which is where Wondrium shines. Courses about the decisive battles of world history or the Great Fire of 1666 are just the tip of the iceberg. Wondrium's collection of short and long-form videos is ever-changing, and keep the experience fresh. You can enjoy Wondrium from your TV, tablet, laptop or phone. And you can download a course or a series and listen to it like a podcast. Please visit wondrium.com/SandRhoman History to discover new topics that you didn't know you needed to know about. Click the link in the description below to start your free trial today. According to the historian Peter Wilson, the Bohemian Revolt was the first serious clash over the political and religious issues the Holy Roman Empire was facing. While a plethora of similar conflicts occurred earlier, like the Cologne War, the Jülich Crisis or the Donauwörth incident, these could always be contained in terms of severity and geographical extent. We recommend watching our video on the outbreak of the 30 Years' War to get a full picture of these early conflicts. Just like these, the Bohemian Revolt started as a local conflict. The Bohemians only revolted against Ferdinand, who at the time was just king of Bohemia and Hungary and not yet emperor. However, the revolt triggered events far outside the Bohemians' control, because the question of who was king of Bohemia was of utmost importance in the governance of the Holy Roman Empire. The king of Bohemia was one of the 7 prince-electors who chose the emperor. Traditionally, 3 of these 7 electors were Catholic archbishops, entirely unlikely to vote for a Protestant. Out of the other 4, all but the King of Bohemia were Protestants. So if the crown of Bohemia fell into Protestant hands, Ferdinand's election as emperor and the continued Habsburg control of the empire was at stake. The question of an election arose because Emperor Matthias, Ferdinand's cousin, was very sick. It became clear that he would soon die. If Ferdinand wanted to secure his own election, it was crucial for him to gain control over the Bohemian crown quickly. This, however, failed completely because some of the Bohemian aristocracy saw their rights, religious freedoms, and career opportunities endangered by anti-Protestant politics and Habsburg favoritism for Catholics. The goal of the Bohemian rebels was to restore the situation of 1608-1609, when they had been granted religious privileges by Matthias and his predecessor Rudolf II. To take the imperial throne from the Catholics was something only very few dared to even think of. Nonetheless, military actions and planning began within days of the defenestration. The local Habsburg commander moved all available men to Budweis and Krummau in order to secure the Linz-Prague road, while all the Bohemian towns besides Pilsen declared their support for the rebellion. In summer, 2 experienced generals took command of the Habsburg forces, Count Bucquoy and Count Dompierre. On the side of the Bohemians, Count Thurn had already opened offensive operations in late June and moved against the Habsburg-held cities of Budweis and Krummau. The contested strategical objectives become clear on a map. The key areas were the roads across the mountainous terrain, the Linz-Prague road, and the road through Moravia from Znaim towards Prague, which could be controlled at Kaslev, at the entry to the Elbe Valley. Military operations gained speed only very slowly, and both parties had time to appeal for assistance. Responses were lukewarm, though. The Pope and the Spanish Habsburgs, the 2 major Catholic allies of the Austrian Habsburgs, sent only a little money because they thought the Austrians were exaggerating the dangers of the revolt. The Austrian Habsburgs also asked for help in Saxony, notably a Protestant state. The Saxons agreed because they thought the Bohemians were misinterpreting the events as a religious matter and sent their militia to the border of Bohemia to close it off. However, Saxony took a mediating position and tried to diffuse tension on the basis of the imperial constitution. The Protestant Union, a coalition formed in 1608 to protect the Protestant interests in the empire and consequently the obvious address for Bohemian appeals, did accept that the revolt was a religious issue, but still failed to vote for any supportive action. But some individual members of the Union, like the Palatinate, supported the Bohemian efforts. Christian of Anhalt, the advisor-in-chief of Frederick V, the Elector Palatine, continued to work behind the scenes to promote an intervention in Bohemia. He realized that England and other international powers were unlikely to help unless the Bohemians could persuade the kingdom's other provinces, like Moravia, Silesia, and Lusatia, to join the rebellion first. Especially Moravia, which was strategically important because it lay between Bohemia, Lower Austria, and Hungary, would need to join the rebellion. So Protestants elsewhere hesitated to help. The Bohemians were increasingly isolated. And soon the situation indeed turned sour for them. When the Counts of Bucquoy and Dompierre moved through Moravia to push for Prague in September of 1618, Thurn moved to Kaslev to block their way through the Elbe Valley. Then, finally, some help arrived. Count Ernst von Mansfeld enters the stage. As a successful mercenary captain with considerable negotiating skills, he was one of the more notorious characters of the war. Remarkably, he was actually Catholic. In 1618, he took command of 2,000 Swiss mercenaries in Ansbach and moved to Pilsen. In October, they were joined by 3,000 Silesians. In November, Pilsen surrendered to him. It would become Mansfeld's base of operation for the coming months. Meanwhile, Bucquoy and Dompierre were still blocked by Thurn. They ran out of food and supplies despite plundering the entire area around Kaslev and were finally forced to retire to Budweis and Krems respectively, having lost half their men to disease and desertion. Thurn now had the upper hand, but he made the mistake of dispersing his men into 3 smaller armies. One staying to besiege Bucquoy, one to bully the Moravians, and one to move toward Vienna. Winter and desertions made life difficult for all 3 groups, and by February of 1619 they had to retreat. The situation changed significantly in March of 1619. The sickly Emperor Matthias died, and Habsburg Austria passed to Ferdinand. Ferdinand knew he had to act quickly if he wanted to secure the imperial throne for himself and his dynasty. Consequently, he sought his subjects' approval and reluctantly confirmed the Bohemian privileges that his predecessors had granted them. He even offered amnesty to the rebels if they laid down their arms. The rebels rejected and thereby committed themselves to open defiance. They could no longer maintain the pretense that they were only opposing Ferdinand, not the entire dynasty. This was the metaphorical crossing of the Rubicon. The die was cast. War was inevitable. In April, Thurn was authorized to invade Moravia, and by May he crossed the Moravian frontier at Znaim. His ambitious target was Vienna itself. Taking the city would persuade the Protestants in Upper and Lower Austria, who were also unhappy with Ferdinand, to fully commit to the rebellion as well. Thurn's plan was to take Vienna with the help from the inside. The only remaining Protestant on the Vienna City Council was to seize control once the Protestant army would breach the city's defenses. Thurn crossed the Danube at Fischermend, east of the city, and waited for a signal of the conspirators near the village of Sankt Max, just outside the city. But his men inside failed to take hold of Ferdinand, who allegedly sought refuge in a chapel. Thurn's conspirators were eventually dispersed. With no signal from the inside and no siege equipment, Thurn had no other choice than to leave on the 12th of June. But this was not the only blow to the Protestant cause. Mansfeld had clashed with Bucquois at Netolitz on the 10th of June and suffered a devastating defeat. These two Catholic victories came just at the right moment for Ferdinand. They allowed him to move to Frankfurt, where the election of the next emperor took place. The other electors ended up voting for him unanimously on the 28th of August. While he gained the title of emperor, however, he had already lost the title of King of Bohemia. On the 31st of July, 1619, the 5 Bohemian provinces formed the Bohemian Confederation. Despite a lot of dissenting voices, the Upper and Lower Austrian Protestant radicals joined them as allies on the 16th of August. On the 19th of August, the Bohemians formally rejected Ferdinand as king, claiming that his ascent to the throne in 1617 had been unconstitutional and that he was never officially their monarch. But Bohemia was set up as a kingdom that needed a king to retain its power within the Holy Roman Empire. The obvious choice for a king would have been the Duke of Saxony, leader of the major Protestant power in Germany, but he was not interested. He just acted as if he might accept the offer, believing he could make the Bohemians join peace talks that he wanted to lead. Another candidate that was considered was Carlo Emanuele of Savoy, who had sponsored the mercenaries under Mansfeld. But he was a Catholic, and when the Austrians found out that he paid for Mansfeld's men, he quickly changed course and offered his services to Ferdinand. The two remaining candidates were Gabor Bethlen, Prince of Transylvania, and Frederick V, Count Palatine. Bethlen wanted a royal title as a means of consolidating his country's endangered independence. At first, he seemed ideal, until he quickly lost influence in Prague when it became clear that the Habsburgs had convinced the Ottomans not to back his efforts to become king in Hungary. Without the Ottoman backing, and without the Hungarian crown, he was not as intimidating. The only option left was Frederick V. He was elected King of Bohemia by the grace of God and the estates on the 26th of August. Much was expected of the young king of only 23 years of age. He should unify the Protestants and bring in some much-needed international support. However, the most likely source of aid, the Protestant Union, only raised troops to deter Catholic reprisals, not to march to Bohemia or to support Frederick. Moreover, there were internal quarrels among the Protestants. Frederick didn't understand some of the complexities of Bohemian Protestantism. When, for example, he tried to prohibit material representations of the supernatural in Calvinist fashion, he was fiercely opposed by Bohemian Protestants. This in turn enraged the Palatine Calvinists, who destroyed medieval artworks, paintings, and saints' tombs in St. Vitus Cathedral at Christmas of 1619. This didn't exactly make Frederick popular with the local population and hindered his efforts to recruit a substantial army a great deal. To make matters worse, there was no additional international support. The Dutch actually stopped their subsidies and only allowed Frederick to recruit 2 regiments from men in their service. The English King James, related to Frederick via the latter's wife, also didn't substantially support the Bohemians. He only offered himself as arbiter, not as a proper ally. Ambassadors and talks, instead of powder and guns. The Danes and Swedes remained idle too. Soon Europeans started joking that Frederick would be saved by the Danes, who would send 1,000 pickled herrings, the Dutch, who would supply 10,000 boxes of butter, and James, who would dispatch 100,000 ambassadors. Because of these internal quarrels and sparse international support, the Bohemians were lacking funds. Their hope increasingly shifted to Gábor Bethlen, the Calvinist prince of Transylvania. Bethlen wanted to become King of Hungary, another title held by Ferdinand II, so Frederick and Bethlen certainly had a common enemy. But there was a huge misunderstanding between the two. Bethlen hoped that the broke Frederick would give him the funds to pay for his constantly underfinanced army of mostly irregular cavalry. He needed a quick success, both to convince the Hungarian Diet to reject Ferdinand and elect him king, and to gain support by the Ottomans. Very quickly, Bethlen prepared an offensive and soon arrived in Pressburg with his army. He was very successful. Garrisons along the military frontier declared for him, leaving only Komorn, Raab and Neutra loyal to the Habsburgs. In November, Bethlen arrived at the walls of Vienna, encircling the city with 42,000 men. The emperor, however, made it into the city in time, ready to defend his capital. But his overall situation wasn't exactly optimal. Luckily for him, Bethlen had to abandon his blockade of Vienna because of a Polish attack on his Transylvanian core territory. The attack on Transylvania was of course a result of long negotiations between the Habsburgs and the Polish king and Lithuanian Grand Duke Sigismund III. Sigismund was as stout a Catholic as Ferdinand himself, and was the obvious choice for an ally. Moreover, his wife was Ferdinand's sister. She championed a pro-Habsburg stance in Poland. In fact, the two had made an agreement to help each other in case of rebellion in 1613. However, Sigismund was disappointed with how little support he had gotten when Sweden invaded Livonia in 1617. We made an entire series about the Polish-Swedish wars if you want to dive deeper into that topic. But to keep things short, Sigismund had a dynastic claim to Sweden, which was challenged by Charles of Sweden. The two states fought over this dynastic dispute and the control of the economically vital cities around the Baltic shore for many years. For now, the Swedes were kept at bay, and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had just finished a war with the Tsars of Russia in 1618, which pushed the border of the Commonwealth to its greatest extent. Sigismund was strong and in a position to help the Habsburgs. But he wanted to do that without committing himself to a long war that would distract from his primary objective of recovering Sweden. So he simply redirected the so-called light Cossack cavalry, who had fought for him in Russia and were currently plundering the borderlands of the Ottoman Empire towards Bethlen's Transylvania. These cavalrymen have entered history under the name Lizovczyce, named after their commander Alexander Lizovsky. The historian Peter Wilson aptly notes that, quote, "The Lizovsky were the kind of cavalry that God would not want and the devil was afraid of." End quote. A force of about 7,000 men under the Upper Hungarian magnate and personal enemy of Bethlen, György Homonai, was sent into Transylvania to wreak havoc. Homonai defeated the Transylvanians in a battle after they had misinterpreted a fake retreat as a real one. The 30 Years' War wouldn't be a, quote, extremely complex conflict, end quote, as Peter Wilson puts it, if there wasn't another twist to this situation. The incursion into Transylvania called the Ottomans into play. They thought of Bethlen as their client, and did not want him to be driven off Transylvania, especially not by the Polish. Considering that the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the Ottoman Empire had recently fought for influence and territory in Moldavia in the Moldavian Magnate Wars, tensions were running high anyways. Because the Ottomans had just made peace with the Persians in the east, they had now ample resources for their western interests. In October of 1620, the Sultan sent the Tatars, backed by Ottoman regulars, into Moldavia where they routed a Polish force at Czechora. In the following year, Sigismund's army would entrench at Hotin and repel a force of Tatars and Turks almost twice its size. We also made a separate video about this event. Although this bound all of the Commonwealth's capacities, so that they couldn't really interfere in Bohemia, the intervention in Transylvania was a success. Bethlen was forced to abandon the siege of Vienna and signed an 8-month truce with Ferdinand. Meanwhile, Sigismund prohibited the Lisowskis to enter Poland and sent them along the mountains to Silesia to reinforce Bucua. There, they helped to push the Habsburg offensive towards Krems over the summer of 1619. Meanwhile, Thurn's Confederate forces were entrenched around Langenlois, where Christian of Anhalt arrived to take command. In July, Mehmed Aga, an Ottoman emissary, reached Prague to deliver the Sultan's congratulation on Frederick's coronation. He wanted to see where the defenestration had taken place and promised Bohemia 60,000 Ottoman auxiliaries. Most people in Prague were rather uncomfortable with the presence of an official Ottoman delegation within their city walls, but their leaders were easily seduced by the idea of a grand alliance that could smash both Poland and the Habsburgs. In a letter to the Sultan, Frederick agreed to make Bohemia a tributary state of the Ottoman Empire, in exchange for assistance. Frederick sent a delegation with 70,000 florins in bribes to Constantinople and promised 300,000 florins to Bethlen. With growing support and financial backing allegedly secured, Bethlen seized control of the Hungarian Diet at Neusohl in August of 1620 and was crowned King of Hungary only 12 days later, although many Hungarians didn't agree with the election and declared for the Habsburgs. In the face of 3 hostile forces, Hungary under Bethlen, Bohemia under Frederick, and the prospect of Ottoman involvement, the Habsburg monarchy was at the verge of collapse. To make matters worse, they were about 20 million florins in debt, while the crown revenue was only 2.4 million. The imperial army alone consumed 5 million florins in pay, provisions and munitions from the beginning of the war to June 1619. Even Spanish and papal subsidies came in only at just around 3 million and provided little help. Overall, the military deficit was about 4.3 million florins, in addition to the monarchy's already existing debt. It was clear that Ferdinand needed substantial help if he wanted to get out of this mess alive. So he knocked on the doors of Spain, France, and the Papal States and tried to deter the Protestant Union from intervening. Moreover, he asked both Bavaria and Saxony to provide direct military support. Now, Bavaria, or more specifically Maximilian of Bavaria, one of the major players of the 30 Years' War, enters the stage. For a long time, he had had ambitions to improve his political situation in the empire. Maximilian was related to Frederick V, who, besides the kingship of Bohemia, was also holding the electoral vote for the Palatinate. Given the pressure the emperor was under, Maximilian saw an opportunity to negotiate a transfer of the electoral vote of the Palatinate to Bavaria, if he were to support Ferdinand against Frederick at the right time and in the right way. Maximilian had been carefully plotting since 1618, even refusing calls for help by Ferdinand while quietly preparing to re-establish the Catholic League, the counterweight to the Protestant League, so to speak, usually just called Liga. Frightened by the Protestant rebellion in Bohemia, the former members of the Liga welcomed the chance to strengthen their security. Maximilian secured himself the exclusive direction of the Liga's military affairs and managed to get Johann Czeklas Tilly, an experienced commander, to take on the role of field commander of the Liga forces. This created a counterweight to the Habsburg-controlled imperial forces, which de facto were led by Bavaria. In January, Ferdinand annulled Frederick's election as Bohemian king. An ultimatum was made to give the crown back, which ran out in June. 5 days later, Ferdinand authorized Maximilian to intervene in Bohemia. Maximilian was a cautious man and waited until both Spain and the papacy endorsed his actions. Especially Spain's aid was crucial, because Maximilian could not safely move against the Austrian and Bohemian confederates without exposing the Liga territories to potential reprisals from the Protestant Union forces. Spanish intervention on the Rhine should keep the Protestants busy in the west, while freeing up the Liga army under the command of Count of Tilly to turn eastwards. At the same time, smaller Spanish contingents started marching from the Netherlands to Passau and from Italy via the St. Gotthard Pass to Bohemia. Moreover, in July, the Liga and Protestant Union agreed on a truce, promising not to fight each other in Germany, leaving Maximilian free to intervene in Bohemia while the Protestants could oppose the Spanish. The Habsburg, Liga, Bavarian, Spanish, Saxon offensive involved 6 armies. Dompierre had to hold Vienna against Bethlen. Bucquoy moved with the Habsburg main force to Lower Austria to move against Anhalt. Maximilian left a force in the Upper Palatinate and moved with the Bavarian main army under the command of Tilly to Upper Austria. Spain invaded the Lower Palatinate and Saxony moved against Lusatia. Upper and Lower Austria quickly collapsed and abandoned the Bohemian Confederation without a single battle, allowing Tilly and Maximilian to join Bucquoy in Lower Austria. Meanwhile, Louis de Velasco deterred the Dutch Republic with 80,000 men, while Spinola invaded Palatine territory west of the Rhine, taking Kreuznach and Alzey. To make matters worse, the main Bohemian army had been paralyzed by 3 pay mutinies and only became active again after the 2nd of August. By this time, Maximilian had joined Bucquoy, which meant the Catholics now substantially outnumbered the Bohemians. Von Anhalt, the Protestant commander, retreated into Moravia, expecting the Catholics to follow him, but Ferdinand and Maximilian followed Tilly's advice and marched directly towards Prague. On their march, the men plundered and pillaged along the way, whilst being plagued by a sickness referred to as Hungarian fever, probably a form of typhus or cholera. It is often said that the 30 Years' War got worse and worse in terms of brutality over time. Even though this is probably true, it is often forgotten that both frequent death at the hands of sicknesses and terrible brutality were present from the outset. 12,000 Catholics died because of the fever before the end of the year, and the Imperial Bavarian troops, Catholics themselves mind you, plundered Catholic monasteries and convents as well as Protestant homes on their way through Austria to Prague. Meanwhile, Anhalt realized his mistake and raced west towards Tabor. By then, the Imperial Bavarian army had already entered Budweis, simply bypassed him in the west, and arrived near Pilsen on the 27th of September. So Anhalt moved to Rokycany and then to Rakovnik, where he dug in. The Imperial Bavarian army didn't attack his position and remained idle. But Tilly, knowing the campaign season was coming to an end, again asserted himself over the other generals, and pushed the army to bypass Anhalt around the ridge and race towards Prague on the 5th of November. Anhalt again had to admit to a mistake and force-marched his men towards Prague, overtaking the Imperial Bavarian army. He arrived at the White Mountain, about 8 kilometers west of the city at midnight on the 7th of November. The White Mountain, Bílé hory in Czech, is rather a ridge than a mountain, and takes its name from the white chalk and gravel pits in the region. It runs northeast to southwest for about 2 kilometers, rising only about 60 meters from the surrounding area. Nonetheless, it would be a strong defensive position if it were defended by a competent and motivated army, especially at the northern end where the incline was steepest. The end of the ridge was covered by a wooded game park featuring a small wall and containing the Star Palace, a small pavilion where Frederick and his wife stayed prior to their triumphal entry to Prague a year earlier. In addition, the Sharka, a marshy stream, ran through the fields about 2 kilometers in front of the Protestant position, but it was deemed too far from the hill to be defended. When Anhalt arrived there, he didn't really expect a battle. He thought the enemy would just stall like before at Rakovnik. Despite this, he arrayed his 21,000 men in 3 lines according to the Dutch manner. That means he deployed his men in small infantry battalions that relied on good discipline and firepower to deter enemies from closing in, while pikemen would step up in case of enemy cavalry attacks. Between the infantry, he had his cavalry in small squadrons, while the light cavalry was positioned in a 3rd line. Frederick himself remained in Prague to eat breakfast, and wasn't with his men at all. The Catholics had the prospect of plundering Prague if they won, a rich city that was well worth the fight. Additionally, the men were tired of chasing the Bohemians around their country, and winter was closing in, which might shift the balance of power in the Protestants' favor. So Tilly asserted himself again and pushed for decisive action. Thick fog obscured the Imperial Bavarian advance on the morning of the 8th of November. They drew up in the Spanish manner, in so-called tercios, positioning 17,000 infantry in 10 big blocks of pikemen, which had the advantage of fostering the morale, but limited firepower because the formation had less width. While 12 pieces of artillery sang their thunderous song throughout the morning with little effect, they proved at least useful in signaling the start of the battle 15 minutes after midday. The Bavarians had more ground to cover to reach the ridge than the Imperials, so the two armies would make contact first on the Imperial Bavarian right. Anhalt quickly sent 2 cavalry regiments down the hill to drive off the Imperial cavalry, who were screening the tercios that spearheaded the assault, while Turn's regiment moved down to engage the enemy infantry. But Turn's men saw their own cavalry retire early, and consequently only fired 1 salvo at extreme range before they fled the field right away. Anhalt's son tried to save the situation by charging his horsemen head-on into the tercio moving up the slope, and for a brief moment it looked like the Protestants might yet stand a chance. But shortly after, more Imperial horses came up and Bucquois arrived to rally the infantry. Within an hour since the start of the battle, Anhalt Jr. was taken prisoner, and all of the Bohemian horsemen were fleeing. The infantry soon joined them, with only some units near the Star Palace resisting for about another half hour before surrendering. The Imperial Bavarian army suffered a mere 650 casualties, mostly to Anhalt Jr.'s brave yet futile charge. The Bohemian Confederates, in contrast, left 600 dead on the field, with a further 1,000 strewn on the way to Prague, as well as 1,200 wounded. Prague had substantial defenses, and it would have been no problem to hold the city over the winter. But the Bohemian Confederate leadership was utterly pathetic. While some tried to organize a defense on the Charles Bridge to stop the Bavarians from crossing the river, Anhalt and Turn thought the situation hopeless. Frederick and his pregnant wife joined the stream of refugees leaving the city eastwards. They left the crown, other insignia, and confidential documents behind because they feared that angry citizens might prevent them from escaping if they took these royal symbols with them. The city, full of riches, was abandoned and left to plunder. On the other side of the theatre of war, Bethlen had pushed to Pressburg, but was stopped by Dompierre, supported by some Hungarians and Austrians. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Sultan, who had actually already ratified the alliance with Frederick, was happy that he didn't intervene on the ground when he heard of the poor display at White Mountain. At the same time, the Ottoman Pasha of Buda seized the Hungarian border fortress of Weizen, which made it clear to most Hungarians that they needed Ferdinand, not Bethlen, to properly protect them. Frederick's involvement as the Count Palatine carried the war to the Palatinate, more specifically the Lower Palatinate near the Rhine. This brought the conflict within striking distance of the Spanish Road, the most crucial means of supporting the Spanish troops in the Netherlands. And guess what? The 12 years truce between Habsburg Spain and the Netherlands that had paused the 80 Years' War was just about to run out. All eyes were on the vital Spanish Road. Not only would this bring the true military giant of the time, the Spanish Habsburgs, dangerously close to intervening in the conflict in Germany, but it also dragged in England, France, parts of Italy, Denmark, and Sweden. The 30 Years' War was about to get a whole lot bigger. Germany really was the powder keg ready to explode.